Hi, Cecilia. I'm the history guy, and John asked me to wish you a very Merry Christmas and talk a little bit about history. He wanted me to mention the Battle of Bladensburg, which occurred August 24th of 1814. Apparently, your parents are buried there in that Fort Lincoln Cemetery, where there's a plaque to the Battle of Bladensburg, which is pretty much the only way that Americans even know about the battle. And he wanted me to talk a little bit about the battle. It would take a lot more time than I have here to describe the whole battle, but it was an interesting battle. It was considered one of the worst defeats by the U.S. Army in history, and it was the battle that left open the road so that the British could burn Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. The short story on the battle is that the Americans outnumbered the British, but the British had more veteran troops. Napoleon was in exile at the time, so they could bring veterans from the Napoleonic Wars over, whereas the Americans were largely militia. And the Americans were terribly led. The American commander, Brigadier General William Winder, was a political appointee. And also there was James Monroe, who was the future president, but at the time was Secretary of State. And they made terrible deployments of the troops, and they were contradicting each other, and the troops were set up so they couldn't support each other. And it's quite possible the battle could have been won had those troops been better led. But for the most part, what happened in the battle is that the militia fought for a while, but the militia eventually broke, and that's against the British regulars, even though the British took a lot of casualties from the American artillery. But the really interesting part of the battle is what's mentioned in that plaque there in the Fort Lincoln Cemetery, because it talks about Commodore Joshua Barney. And Joshua Barney is really an interesting guy. I could do a whole episode on him, and I might sometime for the history guy, because he had a really interesting time in the Revolution. But he had been given command of a flotilla of gunboats on the Potomac, and they had been so outnumbered by the British that eventually they just sent them upriver to be scuttled because they didn't want the British to capture them. So he'd taken his force that had been manning those boats. So he had about 350 some sailors and about 120 some Marines and some heavy guns on a hill. And as the U.S. Army was running away, or as the militia was running away, they ended up being surrounded. But the small group of Marines, 7,000 Americans or so at that battle, it was this less than 500 sailors and Marines that put up such a stout fight and did so much damage to those cannons that it almost broke the British attack. And eventually the British, just by sheer weight of numbers, were able to surround them. But they didn't leave until they literally ran out of ammunition for their guns. And Barney himself was shot in the thigh. He was captured, but he had fought so bravely that the British paroled him right away. And then he died of that wound 4 years later. But when they say ultimate sacrifice that they put on the plaque there, he didn't die right away, but he would die eventually of the wound that he took there at the Battle of Bladensburg. But the British were very much impressed with the stout defense that came from the Marines and the sailors, while the rest of the army had left. And so the Battle of Bladensburg is certainly interesting, and Joshua Barney, who was commemorated on that plaque in the cemetery where your parents are buried, was certainly an interesting fellow who fought bravely in that battle. All deserves to be remembered, and it's something that you can think of when you go to visit your parents' final resting place. So, hope that was interesting to you. It was certainly interesting to me. Have a very Merry Christmas.